Hi, welcome to the Divine Insight Show. Thank you so much for joining me wherever and whenever you're doing so. There's no accident that you're here. I really appreciate your time. And I wanted to talk today really about something I don't really talk about too often on the show. I haven't really shared much about my personal life on the show, I think, in quite some time. But I think it's important to share, and it isn't something that I scripted. This isn't a show that I, laid out or had questions that I had set my mind on asking myself or to answer, but to really kind of share my own personal story and also my experience, particularly around addiction and recovery, because I think it's important for all of us to think about the ways in which we are living in chains or living in binders or things that are keeping us from being our full free selves. And when I think about addiction in particular, this is something that I experienced so much of that kept me really from living my best life for a lot of years. Actually, it wasn't until my mid 30s that I got sober for the first time. So I just want to kind of talk about this, and for a couple of other reasons as well. One, I think even though this sort of topic is something that I have had a lot of shame about in my life and a lot of self-judgment and self-criticism about, I think that when I decide to share this story and be open and vulnerable with the things that I've experienced, I think that it allows others to feel like they can also share the sort of dark underbelly of things that they might feel ashamed of. I can tell you that I spent a lot of years in shame, a lot of years in shame, and hiding this shame in an isolated way from people in my life. And in many ways, I never, until I was in my late 30s, let a lot of people in because I didn't like to see myself in not living my best life. And also I was being strangled by my addiction pattern. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about that and what recovery meant for me. And so if there's something about this that you can relate to or apply in your life and it's helpful, then I hope that you do. And I think that's part of why I get involved in doing the show in the first place and why I started to get on the radio so many years ago. It's that I think that we all have a voice, and it's important that I use mine in a way that can help others. That is my desire, that is my goal. And so, and I can tell you, I'll just be honest with you, I am uncomfortable a little bit right now because, this judgmental ego personality that I have tells me that still there's this tiny little voice in my ear that I can hear that says, oh, you shouldn't talk about that. One, it's selfish. Two, people are going to judge you. Three, this just, you have so much shame around that there's no point. What's the point of going back to the parts of your life that you didn't like, that were your worst? I mean, is there any point for me personally? And so I just wanted to let you know, those are the echoing thoughts that I have in my head right now. But I also know that it's so important to share our stories. And I think also the things that we are the most shameful about, and I think in particular, any addiction pattern that we are experiencing in our life, I think there's a particularly difficult and challenging type of shame, because the thing that I think about is how many thousands of times have I woken up in the morning hungover or high or not having slept for a couple of days and completely out of my mind, and then finally getting some sleep and feeling better and not being paranoid or delusional or having visions, and told myself never again, and living alone in most of that time, feeling like, oh, I don't need anybody's help, I just have to make the decision. And then here we are, not in a situation in my life where I hadn't treated the addiction. Then I had, it's like building a house of cards. I just only had the desire, but I didn't know how to apply it. And then I would fail, quote unquote fail, and then I would drink again, even sometimes the same day, because it was a decision I made in the morning, and then by the afternoon I felt better, and then having not dealt with the psychology around addiction and how that was showing up in my life and the ways in which that I could be hijacked by my own mind, I would drink again. And this was even before a lot of us can relate to that, even as episodic drinkers. If we drink to drunk, and we can then deal with the situation. And most people who don't have alcoholic tendencies or have the disease of addiction in their system or their DNA, can just make that decision and move on and just not drink for a while. And that's very easy for them, but for me, it wasn't. So I think the first time in my life that I actually can look back and say, wow, there was something going on in me that was squirrely. And I use that term squirrely to say, well, there's some sort of addict. I like to think of myself as like there's addict thinking and then there's like my thinking. And until I recognized and developed a relationship with this addict that is me, the same person, then I wasn't able to be aware of the types of thoughts that I was having that just were not true. I mean, I would lie. And in particular, I remember it started as a kid. I would steal change from my dad's coffee can jar that he would put all of his change in. And I used to take quarters out, ride my bike to 7-Eleven, buy some candy, and then eat it, and then ride home. And I did that many times growing up. And that certainly isn't particularly healthy, but I liked to get away with things. I liked the fact that I wasn't getting caught. The danger element was certainly part of it, but I had no idea that there was some addiction pattern going on with sugar. But as a young adult, I also was not honest about my alcohol usage with my parents when I drank in high school. I would lie about it, and I remember, gosh, this was like when I was 4 or 5, sitting in my dad's lap, driving the truck, camping, and he had an Oli. He used to drink Oli in those days, and he had that, and he was holding that, and I used to think, wow, cool, looking up to my dad, this was like drinking beer while driving to go camping in eastern Washington, in northern Idaho and Montana. This was something that felt normal, right? It was normalized, and so anyway, I do remember actually asking him to have a drink of it when I was a kid. I loved sitting in his lap and like having my hands on the steering wheel and stuff. And later in life, having been somebody that has drank to drunk and also driven dozens of times while intoxicated, creating risk for myself and others, and even totaling a car, it's just like, this just wasn't in my mindset to say, wow, I've really got a problem here. I just thought, oh, I just make a decision not to drink and I won't do it again, but then I continue to do it. So what is that, right? I mean, and it's a terribly painful cyclical process of pattern development in the body. So, and ultimately, I found my bottom, as they call it, in the recovery program, right, that lowest thing that you finally decide I'm going to get help, was after my mom died and my boyfriend at the time, we broke up, and I didn't have much coping mechanisms. This was back in 2004. I was still an active alcoholic, but I hadn't been introduced to drugs at a addict type level until after that. So this was 2004, and I had a new job, a new house that I really didn't want to live in. Different story for another time. But I had alcohol and television, and this was what I did. I went to work all day, and I came home and I made dinner and I drank until I got drunk, played with my dog, and took care of him. And then I was introduced to meth online at this Craigslist ad, this person that I had met, that I connected with, and that drug became a part of my usage history slowly and incrementally over time. It wasn't like I woke up in the morning and thought, oh, this is really a great day to do meth. But what would happen was I would get drunk, and my rational brain, of course, would go away, and I would just get drugs. And it seems so strange to me now thinking about it, but that became a slowly increasing pattern in my life. And also, it wasn't like I ever wanted to drink to the point of getting to the point where I would do something that was dangerous or harmful, but but that became my story. It became a part of what I did, and the guilt and shame that I had around that, and the more isolating I became in my personal life, I sort of felt like, well, I'm still at my job, and I was performing successfully when I wasn't calling in sick. But it became a pattern, and in 2006, I just recognized that I needed help. And it didn't have any sort of legal consequences to require me to go to treatment, but I knew that I needed it. And so I went into inpatient treatment at a recovery center in Kirkland, in eastern Seattle area. And I was so glad that I did. It was a monumental experience in my life that really helped me understand the nature of addiction and how it works in the brain. I didn't really understand it. Obviously, thinking I'm okay and being in denial about that is like one of the main symptoms about addiction. And when I talk about addiction, I'm not talking just about people who use alcohol or drugs, right? Alcohol being a drug, is that we can become addicted in our brain psychologically and even physically as basically, to an escapist pattern of ways in which we don't want to look at parts of our life, or we aren't feeling well. We want to change how we feel. We don't like what's going on, so we want to escape it. And we do that however is most compelling. Our brain has this like reward system in it that says, oh, I want more dopamine. And I don't like how I'm feeling, and I want to be happy. So how do I get that the quickest way possible? And so we'll do this little analysis, and then the brain will say, well, that carb, that bagel really made me feel good, or that ice cream, or that alcohol, or even television. It can animate our system and like activate our system. So that reward system becomes a pattern and something that we can recognize and then follow. So excuse me. when I got out of treatment, I had all this time on my hands that I would otherwise spend looking for alcohol, buying alcohol, and drinking alcohol. And I got into the program of Narcotics Anonymous because I felt at that time more strongly related to the way in which they defined addict versus being alcoholic. I sort of felt like calling myself an addict felt closer to home for me. And so I got plugged into Narcotics Anonymous, and I did that for about 2.5 years. I had a couple of relapses during that time, and like 3, I think, right around the time when you get your chips, which is kind of funny. That's sort of a psychological way in which the program is reinforced to support you at times when your brain chemically actually will start craving again. And it's around those incremental times when you get sober or change a pattern that the brain suddenly kind of feels a little bit shifty. So like at 30, 60, 90 days, 6 months, year and a half, 2 years, and then every year after that. So that's actually when I started to do more spiritual work. I realized I was exploring. I needed more out of my life than I was receiving. And even though professionally I looked really good, I had gotten through law school and had a great job at the city of Seattle. And I worked there for 20 years up until, last fall or last summer of 2019, last spring. But I needed more. There was something more. The calling, ultimately that I realized that I had in my life was related to my spiritual nature and my spiritual work. And so that became necessary for me to look at because I needed that more spiritual growth in order to develop myself personally and interpersonally. And then I had another addiction cycle come up even after I started to do healing work. I started drinking again casually. I thought I could control it, so it became something that I did on occasion. And it's just really funny to me the way that the sort of addict mind thinking and the sort of Travis's higher self, full knowledge thinking, sometimes will get thwarted. Meaning the addict mind will sort of rationalize a safe drink as being okay for future drinking at some point. which sounds ridiculous for anybody who is like not an alcoholic and who can drink casually and just put it away. It's like, this is complete, it can sound absolutely crazy. Like, why would you think that? But it's because it comes from an irrational place. And, you know, the dis-ease of addiction and the neurology around alcoholism in particular is quite difficult to understand. I mean, the likelihood of somebody going into treatment and being sober from then on for the rest of their lives is about 3%, according to the last time I checked, which sounds like a pretty low success rate if you're looking at 3% success rate of those people that go into treatment and stay sober for the rest of their lives. What I like to think of it as, it's more like, it's not a once and done situation. It's like it ebbs and flows. And that's part of what is so challenging about this particular disease is that it's important to understand that it's not just the substance that is affecting you in your life, but it's also the way of thinking, a way of thinking. And it's not just, you know, the choice to make to stop drinking that will help you not do that, because there are other factors that can cue up your brain to be hijacked, whether that's environmental factors, behavioral patterning, such as if I always watch TV and drink, then if I watch TV, even when I'm sober, I will likely get a craving for alcohol, at least for some period of time, something like that. So you have to like really reconsider everything that you do if you're trying to cut a habit out. And I think the other thing to keep in mind with respect to patterns is it really takes several weeks, at least 3 in particular, to really break a pattern. So when you first have something in your life that you want to change, maybe you're watching or listening and saying, oh wow, I really need to look at how much, you know, sugar I intake, and I've really been thinking about it. You know, if it's something that, and I'll tell you this, it's not just the use of the substance that is part of the addict process. It's also the obsession or the rumination about it. So if there's something in your life that you just tend to think about a lot and makes you feel guilty for doing it, and you know it's bad for you, then, you know, think about coming to a relationship with yourself with a bit more kindness. And in particular, saying, okay, separating yourself from the thoughts that you're having. Instead of saying, I'm a terrible person, I hate myself, I really want to look at why I do this, and I don't like doing this, meaning I don't like doing whatever the thing is, whether it's high sugar or addictive eating or drugs or alcohol. It's like, you know what, regardless of any other thing, I deserve compassion for myself. And so I started to actually separate myself from the thoughts that I was having. So what I noticed was, instead of saying, I really want to drink right now, I would say, wow, I'm having a thought that tells me I want to drink. I wonder what that's about. I wonder what is going on in my day or my life right now that's making me feel like I want to drink. Or if it's food, you know, that I know is bad for me, it might be something like that. Like, I wonder, I'm really craving this thing. But my point is really developing a separation of the thoughts that you're having that are judgmental and critical, and just noticing that you're having them without diving on and agreeing with them is a really important thing that we can do to start separating ourselves from jumping onto the train of that negative patterning. Because I even noticed that I was somewhat addicted to negative patterned thinking and self-critical judgments, and I was having them all the time. I just wasn't conscious of them. I wasn't making myself aware of them. And as soon as I did, with open reflection, I was like, gosh, why don't I love myself? What's that about? Where did that coming from? It didn't come from my parents, you know, they never said, you know, you're not lovable. They always told me I was lovable. So it came from my own projection of self, of being lack of, based on whatever it is that I filled in, like not being good looking enough, having hair in places I didn't want hair, you know, having that beautiful body, things like that, which I realized were just not true. And then I started, instead of comparing myself to other people, I said, well, I'm just gonna start loving myself more. And I really developed a really much better relationship with myself, because I realized that's the most important relationship that I have, because if I don't really have a strong relationship with myself, then every engagement that I had with, whether that be of someone that I was dating, was just going to be terrible and not work out well. And most often that was the case for me in my dating life for many years, up until in my 40s, which was not that long ago. I'm still 40, I'm 46 right now, but I was still having this stuff come up with respect to my self-critical thinking and self-judgments, which I realized was just another negative pattern that I wanted to recover from. And so I think that's just something else to think about. And I really wanted to just share some information about that, my process, for people that might have been confused. I think that, or not know, if you're new to the show or new to my work, then you might not have known. I don't present like somebody who's been addicted to meth and been in inpatient treatment twice. I went for the second time in 2013. And I needed it. And at that time, I did a non-12-step recovery program at a Native American reservation on Orcas Island. And that was what I needed, which was a slightly different step in the direction of my recovery. And it was more aligned with my spiritual beliefs. And I did participate further in the program of AA that time, not NA. And ultimately, I fully support anybody who uses AA or NA in their recovery, or CA, which is Cocaine Anonymous, or CMA, Crystal Meth Anonymous, or any of the other recovery programs, because one, it's very cheap, frankly. It's a cheap hour of time where you're not drinking, or whether that's Overeaters Anonymous, or any of the other ways in which we need to look at our lives and get support and help for doing that. I also highly believe in therapy. I went to therapy before I went into treatment the second time, twice a week. And I started that treatment actually about a month and a half before I went into treatment. And it was every other week. And I continued that therapy for 6 years, all the way up until my move to LA last summer. I continued that therapy and also had an addiction counselor. So I think, first off, it's like anything else in your life, recognizing that you have a problem, meaning there's something going on in your day that you don't feel like yourself. If you're feeling and you're noticing thoughts that you're having that are really critical, or that you feel guilty about something that you do, or you ruminate or obsess about that thing, then I think it's important to look at that and say, oh gosh, look at me. I'm having thoughts that I don't like, and I'm engaging in behaviors that are self-destructive. I don't want to do that. I wonder how I could get some help for doing that. And I think that's like the first step, right, in this recovery process, is recognizing that you have a problem, but two, knowing you're not alone and getting the help that you need. So reaching out to somebody who you know who's been struggling with that. I think the fact that we have online activities that I didn't have when I was first getting sober, that I'm aware of, that I remember, was, I think there's much more easier access to going and getting the help that you might need. But whether that's going to a program of recovery, or getting some treatment, talking to somebody who is sober or having had dealt with that as well in their lives. And I think kind of also with that goes, what's my relationship with myself? Because if I truly and absolutely loved myself, then I wouldn't be engaging in these thought patterns or actual behaviors that are harming myself in my life. And I think those are kind of the main areas that I really wanted to kind of share with you about my life and experience. And I don't think that recovery is just a once and done situation, and it's not for most of the people that I know. And I'm not saying that can't happen with you. What I've noticed in my experience is that I set myself up for failure hundreds and hundreds of times every time I said never again, and then I did it again, because that compounded the guilt and shame that I felt around that behavior. So what I would encourage you to do is to think about reducing the behavior a bit first. Obviously, abstinence is like usually the very first thing that everyone will try to tell you, and is obviously effective if you can do it, and deal with the consequences, and then hope that the pattern after 3 weeks, you don't have the cravings or whatnot. But what I would tell you is that be realistic with yourself. If you're addicted or not, and there's something going on in your life that you're doing, or behaviors that you're not, and that you don't believe are loving to yourself, then work on your relationship with yourself and the thoughts that you have around whatever you're working on. And I think you might find that to be helpful. I also encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm very open about my experiences, and I would be happy to share more information with you. I've also found it particularly helpful to get supportive therapies for my physical body that I could certainly share with you and give you more information about. But with that, I just want to say, if you're struggling in your life, you can get help. You are loved more than you could possibly imagine right now. If you're suffering, I've been there. There have been days where I prayed to die, and I prayed harder than anything that I would just be killed like that in those moments where I was the most desperate, where I'd been awake maybe for 3 or 4 days, holed up in my house, and just terrified of everything around me. And if that's your experience at times, then I just want you to know that you're not alone, and you can always reach out to me and get the help that you need and the support and love that you deserve. And you can also, I want to remind you that I do a live Instagram show, essentially on my Instagram. It's not really a show, but it's a live on Tuesdays at 5:30 p.m. Pacific. I go on Instagram and I answer questions, and I do live readings and healings. So if you're wherever you are, I encourage you to tune in at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesdays for about 15 or 20 minutes, and I will do as many readings as I can in that time, answer questions that you might have, maybe about identifying your own spirituality, or if you have a question about recovery or what that might look like for you, or need some help and resources, you could also tune in then. Feel free to send me an email, travis@divineinsight.com, and I can certainly help you with any energetic things, or actually as a life coach and counselor, in that sense, not in a formal, not psychiatric counselor, but as an intuitive consultant, I'll put it that way, and life coach. I can also help you navigate these situations that you might be facing. And if you're interested in doing that, then you can go to my website at divineinsight.com, go to the sessions page, and just book a half-hour session and say, look, I need some help, and I'd love to work with you, and I can help identify what's going on with you energetically and spiritually and physically, because I'm a medical intuitive and I can feel, hear, and see your energy body. And you can find that can be quite helpful as well. So I encourage you to get whatever help that you need. It's there for you. You deserve it. You're loved. And with that, I want to wish you the most wonderful week. And you've been watching or listening to the Divine Insight Show.